Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Krista Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Out of all the infamous serial killers that filled the headlines during the 1970s and 80s, none was as prolific and cunning as Samuel Little, the choke and stroke killer. A man who, much like the Golden State Killer, would go on killing into old age and only be apprehended in the 2010s through DNA technology, long after his killing spree was over. But unlike Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, Samuel Little had been suspected and even arrested for many sexual assaults and even murders. How and why was he repeatedly let go again and again to kill and kill, strangling upwards of 93 women over a 35-year period? It is both the bizarre and sad portrait of life in a marginalized segment of society and the story of his eventual confession, and his life story is stranger and darker than any piece of fiction you could ever read. Ladies and gentlemen, today we bring you the story of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history.
Let's begin. Prologue. Jillian and Mr. Sam. In October of 2017, writer Jillian Lauren was researching a mystery novel, and delving into the intricacies of police work, she interviewed legendary Los Angeles homicide detective Mitzi Roberts, whom the fictional detective Renee Ballard from Michael Connelly's books is based on. Ostensibly asking her about the infamous Black Dahlia case, since Mitzi worked cold cases, and the 60-year-old case had been assigned to her. As they talked over theories of how the beautiful Elizabeth Short had ended up drained of blood and cut in half in the shadow of the Hollywood sign, Jillian casually asked Mitzi what was the coolest thing she'd done during her career in law enforcement. Mitzi replied that she'd actually arrested a serial killer using DNA technology. Jillian perked up. Really? You caught a serial killer using DNA from a cold case?
Mitzi explained how the murders, 3 of them, happened back in the 1980s, and she'd caught the killer in 2014 by taking DNA off the evidence, particularly matter taken under the fingernails during the autopsy, which had been saved. And Mitzi suspected this killer of many, many more murders, saying he'd gotten away with it by constantly being on the move, never staying in the same place for very long, and choosing marginalized women on the outskirts of society that he didn't think would be missed.
Jillian was a diehard true crime buff, had been since she was a little girl and read Nancy Drew, dreaming of one day solving a murder. And she was surprised she'd never heard of this serial killer Samuel Little before. She researched him and found he had a 100-page-long rap sheet and had been arrested in 24 states for theft, battery, assault, rape, even murder, but had always either gotten off or served a very short prison sentence. During a 60-year life of crime, he'd served less than 10 years in prison before finally receiving a triple life sentence in his 70s, thanks to Mitzi's DNA testing.
Jillian was intrigued. She pitched a story about this unknown serial killer who was suspected of so many more murders to her editor at New York Magazine, and the editor agreed on a story.
Jillian decided she needed to hear his story directly from him, so she wrote him a letter in prison.
We've seen where that can go in our last episode.
Yes, we have. But in Jillian's case, she didn't lie. She told him she was a writer and interested in hearing his story. He quickly wrote back, bizarre ramblings, some in all capitals, on pages of torn scraps with creepy doodles, proclaiming his innocence, saying he was framed. And after corresponding a few times, she headed out to California State Prison in Los Angeles County and met with him face to face. He was an old black man in a wheelchair with a devilish glint in his blue-gray eyes. He'd had a toe amputated from diabetes and was suffering from a bad heart condition. He quickly wheeled up on her, wagging a finger, and said,
You, my angel, come to visit me from heaven. God knows I was lonely, and he sent me you.
Sam told Jillian how he was related to both Malcolm X and Little Richard. They talked about art, Sam saying the only two things he'd ever been good at were drawing and boxing. But Sam steadfastly proclaimed his innocence. He refused to speak about the crimes, saying he didn't know anything about them.
Jillian returned the very next day, hoping she could get him to talk about the crimes. And again, he claimed he was innocent, that he'd been framed. Even if his DNA was on those dead sex workers, that doesn't mean he was the one who had killed them.
Jillian called bullshit. She suspected he had killed many women, and told him so. She was just about to give up on the stubborn old man, thinking the trip a waste of time, not even worth the gas money, when Sam suddenly said to her,
I want a television.
I want things too, she told him.
You gonna buy me a TV?
I don't know, Sam, am I? His eyes went dead, and he laughed eerily as he drummed his long yellow fingernails on the table.
What do you want to hear about your story, little miss? You want to hear about the first one? Huh? She was a big old blonde, round about the turn of the new year, 1969 to 1970. Miami, Coconut Grove. She crossed them big legs in her fishnet stockings and touched her neck. That was my sign from God.
And with that, Samuel Little began to tell her about murder after murder after murder, describing 16 of them in intimate detail. Jillian couldn't believe what she was hearing. These weren't killings in California in the 80s, like he was in prison for. These were murders all over the southern East Coast, way back in the early 70s. Stunned, she asked him what it felt like to take a woman's life. Sam smiled, looking like an old grandfather with bushy gray eyebrows, and said,
Ooh-wee, it was like heaven. Felt like being in bed with Marilyn Monroe.
For the next 2 years, Jillian would talk to Samuel Little nearly every day. There were countless phone calls. She visited him every Sunday, and they developed a bizarre relationship, Sam calling her his adopted daughter, Jillian simply calling him Mr. Sam.
Samuel Little described a 35-year murder spree where he strangled 93 women to death as he crisscrossed the country, aided and abetted by various people at different times, telling Jillian his entire life story as well, including his thoughts on religion and life. He also drew her detailed portraits of each of his victims.
Jillian would use the information he gave her to solve cold cases, seeking out the areas he told her of and searching archives looking for murdered women, literally solving decades-old murder cases. Law enforcement across the country used the drawings Samuel gave Jillian to identify Jane Does. And to this day, the drawings are on the FBI website. We can put a link, and the FBI would confirm 63 of the killings, making Samuel Little by far the most prolific serial killer in American history.
Samuel Little made Jillian the sole beneficiary of his last will and testament. calling her his daughter, but also saying that he owned her now. She turned her experiences into the book, Behold the Monster, which is seriously one of the best true crime books I've ever read. She's an absolutely amazing author, and it is also the main source we will be using for our show today.
And as a treat for you, dear listeners, we will be bringing Jillian on the show later this week to tell us about her experiences in a bonus episode. Be sure to keep your eye out for it and give it a listen. But for now, let's delve into the life and times of Samuel Little. Chapter 1: The Baby and the Rag and Bone Man. Samuel Little was born on June 7th, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, a small rural town about 60 miles south of Atlanta.
Details of Sam's birth vary. Some say his mother, Bessie Mae, was a prostitute and that he was born in jail. But Sam's mother says that is not true at all. According to her, she was just a 16-year-old girl who met a teenage boy named Paul McDowell and gotten pregnant. And her grandmother, Josephine, delivered the baby in their shotgun shack on the south side of town.
Bessie's mother had died in childbirth, and Josephine had promised she'd never let her granddaughter suffer the same fate, so she saw the pregnancy as a curse. They'd tried all manner of folk remedy, trying to induce a miscarriage by having Bessie drink turpentine. They'd tied a rope around her waist and heaved on it, even pushed her down a flight of stairs. But the baby was strong and stubborn.
When Bessie went into labor, Josephine had literally ripped the baby from her granddaughter's womb, reaching in and grabbing him by the shoulders and bracing her foot on the bed frame, then heaved and yanked the infant free.
The infant was huge, 12 pounds and pale-skinned, blue-eyed, what they called an eaten chalk child, and they considered the pale features a bad sign, the sins of an ancient slave master revealing themselves genetically. Supposedly, Sam's grandmother looked down at the newborn infant and whispered into his face, "I curse you."
It is also said there was fetus papyraceus, or the remnant of a twin, and that Sam had absorbed his sibling in the womb, or as his grandmother supposedly put it, quote,
"Greedy bastard. He had a twin up in there and he gobbled him up."
Believing the baby to be a curse, Josephine would not allow the infant to be named. She would not touch him, wouldn't even look at him. And a few months later, telling her granddaughter she was a disgrace who'd killed her own mother, she told her to either abandon the baby in the forest or leave the house, saying,
"You want to act like a slut? Go walk the streets like one, and take that chalk-eating beast with you. You have a bed to come back to if you come back alone."
It was night, pouring rain, as Bessie Mae staggered out, clutching her baby to her chest, stumbling through muck and mud, walking until, exhausted, she collapsed.
She was only 16 years old, a child herself, really. Seeing no other alternative, she prayed to Jesus, then left the baby there in the rain and mud, looking upwards, eyes facing God.
And this is some serious, like, Cormac McCarthy kind of shit that happens next. There's this... Have you read Outer Dark?
I haven't, but I've read enough Cormac McCarthy to be inclined to agree with you.
This is just like the book Outer Dark, man. It's like, it's crazy. So there's this rag and bone man. He's like a peddler of used goods. My mom grew up in inner Baltimore City, and she would talk about the rag and bone mans coming by in their carriages. It's like an old-timey thing. But this guy, he had no legs, and he rode around in a cart pulled by a goat. So this legless rag and bone man, He finds the baby there in the mud on the side of the road. And just from looking at the face of the baby, he can tell that he's a member of the McDowell family. And the father is probably teenage Paul McDowell. And he was right.
Paul considered himself quite charming with the ladies, and he and his friends would wager on which girls he could seduce. That's how he ended up sleeping with Bessie May, on a bet to see if he could do it.
Paul's father was named Henry, but everyone called him Biggin, and his mother was named Fanny. And when Biggin and Fanny saw the little baby, they too could tell their son Paul was the father.
Since Paul was just a kid, Fanny and Biggin decided to raise the baby as their own and named him Samuel, which means heard by God.
Supposedly, as Fanny stared down into his watery blue eyes, she said to the baby,
"He's lucky he's a boy and not a girl, 'cause I would have had the cripple throw him in the river."
In 1942, the family left Georgia and headed to Lorain, Ohio, where the war was creating good jobs in the steel mills. They were part of the tail end of what is called the Great Migration, a period from around 1910 to 1940, when over 1.5 million African Americans moved from the South to escape discrimination and violence, and to urban areas in the North and West where jobs were plentiful.
Sam was only 2 years old, but he'd keep moving and traveling nearly the rest of his life, never staying in one place too long. Samuel's real father, Paul, was fighting in Germany, and Samuel believed Biggin and Fanny were his parents. In 1945, when Paul returned home, it was decided to let Samuel go on believing he was Paul's brother, not his son. And Paul soon married and had 7 children, whom Samuel thought were his cousins, not his half-siblings.
Fanny and Biggin did their best to raise Samuel, but they struggled and were getting on in years. And Samuel was a bit of a street urchin, running amok, dirty and ragged old hand-me-downs, really like something out of the Little Rascals. But unfortunately, life is not always nice. And at a very young age, he was sexually assaulted by his uncle. He grew up running around, stealing car batteries, trying to save up his pennies. He was athletic and wanted to play baseball, but he couldn't keep track of when and where to meet for practice.
He hated school, did terribly. The other kids made fun of him for being dirty and dressed in ragged clothes, especially the girls. Sam loved to stare at pretty girls, was utterly infatuated with their beauty, daydreamed that they were actual angels descended from heaven. But they were all mean to him, and he began to fantasize about their necks.
Just thinking about the neck of a pretty girl got little Samuel incredibly sexually excited, like throbbing, though he was too innocent to even understand what these feelings were. He describes it as a feeling akin to being in the candy aisle of a drugstore.
In the spring of 1953, Sam and a group of neighborhood kids decided to run away and go on a crime spree. They hopped a Greyhound bus and headed to Oberlin College, where they stole some bicycles and were quickly apprehended by police. Really just more Little Rascals shenanigans, but Sam would end up getting thrown into Ohio's Boys Industrial School for 2 years.
The Boys Industrial School, or BIS, was a notoriously sinister reform school. As you can imagine, there Sam was beaten, shackled, and most likely molested, falling asleep at night to the sound of young boys being raped. But Sam learned to fight, learning to be the aggressor, and after 2 years, he was sent back to Fanny and Biggin.
Samuel began to develop a fascination with detective magazines, the sleazy, pulp, true crime stuff they'd have in drugstores at the time. He'd steal the magazines, poring over the disturbing crime scene photos. And then he found an image on page 38 of the March 1956 issue of Inside Detective that changed his life forever.
It was the crime scene photograph of a woman strangled to death, a scarf of bruises around her throat, her eyes stained red with petechial hemorrhaging. This photograph brought it all together. His obsession with power, dominance, and necks. His burgeoning sexuality now fully awakened and doused with murderous violence. He pinned the photograph to his wall and masturbated over the image of the lifeless body countless times.
The neck became the source of all eroticism and sexual pleasure. In his mind, strangulation and sex became synonymous. He even learned that if he looped a rope around his own neck and leaned into it, cutting off his air and circulation, the intensity of his orgasms would be multiplied.
Something I would not recommend as it kills hundreds of people a year, including celebrities. But in my research, I learned something. I thought pretty much only men died doing this, but apparently a lot of women die doing autoerotic asphyxiation as well. But then again, it is a great way to stage a murder as an accident, isn't it? Just saying, throwing that out there. Don't look at I'm not incriminating myself.
Sam, in his quest for American upward mobility, decided he wanted to be a pimp and felt he needed to dress the part. So he broke into a dry cleaner and stole 2 suits and a stylish straw fedora hat.
I mean, come on. Stealing isn't good. We don't condone stealing, but you gotta love that. He stole 2 slick suits and a fedora. I mean, that's a stylish crime.
When his friends saw him strolling through town in his new duds, they told him he was crazy. He was bound to get caught. So he took the suits and the hat back to the dry cleaners, seeking forgiveness, which he did not find. Instead, he was sentenced to 17 months in the Ohio State Reformatory.
It was in the Ohio State Reformatory that he saw his birth certificate for the first time and realized his name was actually Little, not McDowell, confirming all the whispers and gossip he'd been hearing all his life. He got tough, learned to box, practicing all day, pushing his mattress up against the wall and using it as a punching bag. And he was good, real good. So good they even gave him nice shiny shorts and real boxing shoes. Soon he'd even earned himself a nickname, Mad Daddy the Machine Gun. And in 1960, he knocked out the reigning champ to become the middleweight champion of the Ohio State Reformatory.
He also learned to draw, a skill he'd practice for the rest of his life, seeing himself as an artist, saying drawing gave him the same thrill as stealing.
What is up with that? I don't know what to make of it. Drawing is the same as stealing. I don't know. Is he capturing an image, you think? Or is it stealing the pencils and our paper? I don't know. What is up with that?
I don't know. It's weird.
I mean, he takes lives. It's like almost is taking an image. Like, who knows? Who knows?
It was also during this time in the reformatory that he began receiving letters from his real mother, Bessie May. She'd moved to Florida and encouraged him to come visit her there, saying she was so sorry she'd abandoned him. She'd just been a frightened child with nowhere to go, and she'd long regretted and lamented leaving him there in the mud and rain.
Sam was released in 1961, but was quickly caught stealing and put right back in, falling back into the routine of prison life, and again winning the middleweight championship, holding the boxing title in 1963 and 1964 until he was finally released again in 1965 at the age of 25 years old.
Sam made an effort at a career in boxing, but he found the boxing world cruel and vindictive, with mean trainers, arrogant managers, and after a fight where he thought he was mistreated and used, he threw his gloves in the trash and swore off boxing for the rest of his life.
Having lived nearly half his life in reform school and prison, he was a virgin. And he married a woman named Jackie Pellerin just so he could see what a woman looked like naked. But it was a loveless affair. He spent the nights out at bars, looking for weed and other women, getting in trouble, wrecking the car they shared. He picked up a woman in a bar one night, went back to her place, and when she tried to charge him money for sex, he went into a rage and beat her, throttling her throat, squeezing it till she was senseless, then stormed out. When she came to, she called the police and told them that he had broken into her home through the window and raped her.
So Sam packed up the car, grabbed his wife, and headed out to Florida to see his mother, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. But he needn't have been too worried anyway. The police could see that he hadn't come in through the window, as the woman, who was already known to the police, had said. It was snowing out, and there were not tracks going in from the bolted window. So the cops didn't take the incident seriously.
In Florida, Sam's mother, Bessie Mae, was ecstatic at the sight of her big, strong, 6-foot tall, muscular son, and she pulled him all around the neighborhood, showing him off and exclaiming,
"I told you I had a son. Look at my big, strong son." Bessie Mae lived in an area called Coconut Grove, which at that time, in 1966, was a historically black neighborhood, though the first signs of gentrification were on their way, with beatniks and hippies beginning to move in.
While Sam and his wife enjoyed being in the warmth of Florida and marveling over actually finding coconuts, the relationship with his mother took on a strange and incestual turn. The mother and son would get drunk and then lie in bed together, and she'd have him suck on her breast to make up for not having fed him as a baby like she should have. Very bizarre.
Things got so weird, Sam and his wife Jackie headed back to Ohio. But after the previous rape charge and other incidents, Jackie's parents arranged for her to get a divorce from Sam and move back in with them.
So Sam took off to Baltimore. There, he entered a liquor store, put his hand in his pocket as if he had a gun, and told the old man behind the counter to give him all his money. Lightning quick, the old man pulled out a .38 and shot Sam 5 times, once in the arm, the side, and 2 in the back. Do not fuck around in Baltimore. I grew up there. Tough town.
Sam was hospitalized and then sent off to prison. While he was in prison, he heard his cousin Malcolm X had been murdered, followed a few years later by Reverend Martin Luther King. Sam thought they both were fools, fighting fights that couldn't be won, and got what was coming to them. He just cared about getting his.
In 1969, Sam was released from prison when he went back to Florida to live with his mother again, working as a grave digger during the day and prowling the honky-tonks and juke joints at night, seeking out the dark corners of Miami and the people that dwell there, the hustlers and pool sharks, sex workers and drug fiends.
Chapter 2. The First Time. It was after midnight, New Year's Eve, now officially 1970, when Samuel Little came strolling into that dark and lonely bar and saw, sitting there, a white woman amongst all the regular black folks. And he knew that she saw him too, because he was looking sharp in his shark-skin bell-bottoms and wide-collar shirt. He strolled right up to her, flashed her his charming blue eyes, and said,
"What you doing all alone, little kitten?"
She smiled and said, "I'm not alone anymore."
Her name was Mary, and she was originally from Boston, but had fallen on hard times and ended up in Miami.
Sam nursed his beer while he bought her drink after drink, gin and tonic, doubles, until she began to slur her words. Then he asked her,
"Want to come with me for a little cruise, sugar?"
Only if it's a Caribbean cruise.
Your cruise ship awaits.
He knew she'd be impressed with his car as well. A gold 1964 Wildcat. Samuel Little loved cars.
He drove her out through the warm Florida New Year night to 170th Avenue, where it turns into a dirt road, then out into a secluded spot in the trees, pulling to a stop, turning off the engine. The sounds of cicadas filling the warm night air.
They kissed, and he removed her fishnet stockings, stroking her thighs, licking the patterns left by the elastic, taking in her scent, and then fixating on her throat. Her pale, lovely throat, where all life flowed and ebbed, slipping a hand to it and caressing it, kneading it as she swallowed.
That's right. Swallow for me. I love it when you swallow.
With one huge, powerful hand, he tightened his grip on her neck and began to squeeze, overcome with erotic ecstasy, and with his other hand unzipped himself and masturbated as she struggled and gasped, not releasing his grip until she'd gone limp and slipped into unconsciousness. When she batted her eyes open and looked about, he told her,
You're beautiful. I own you. You're mine. And then he kissed her.
She spat back at him. Are you trying to kill me, you son of a bitch? Go ahead then, kill me. Get it over with.
Sam looked at her and said, Okay.
It's important to note here that this is Sam's version of what happened and seems heavily romanticized. But there is no doubt that whatever the details may have been, Mary Jo Brosley would be the first of up to 93 women that Sam would strangle to death on a decades-long murder spree.
And 1970 would see two more murders. Linda, a 22-year-old black prostitute, followed by Mary Ann, a very young black trans woman. Both murders that the police didn't care much about and had no intention of trying to solve. Sam learned two things. He really enjoyed killing. And if he found a victim that was marginalized enough, no one would even care.
Chapter 3. Jean. In July of 1972, Sam returned to Lorain, Ohio to visit Fanny. Biggin had died and Fanny was in bad shape, diabetes taking its toll, her ankles so swollen she could barely walk. Sam stayed with her a few days, enjoying the cooking and love from the woman he'd grown up thinking was his mother, but then felt that calling of the road, the need to keep on moving.
Fanny begged him to stay longer, but he was just plain too restless. So he stole $20 from her and hit the road with a prostitute named Lucy he'd picked up, offering to be her new pimp.
But Sam and Lucy never made it out of Ohio. After robbing a liquor store in Cleveland, they were quickly apprehended for armed robbery and thrown in jail.
In jail, Lucy had a cellmate named Aurelia Dorsey, whom everyone simply called Jean. Oh, Jean. Jean is going to play a very pivotal role in this story. Jean, she was really a character. In Arkansas, where she had grown up, they called her the Black Mare because she had skin as black as pitch and carried a mare's leg pistol and had shot the sheriff right in the ass with it, landing her in a chain gang at the age of 20.
She named herself after the sultry movie star Jean Harlow, tap danced in the circus, was friends with Tina Turner and Bo Diddley, and had hopped freight trains disguised as a man. Along the way, she had learned to become a master thief, shoplifting clothing and selling it on the streets, setting up her own little underground vendor booth of stylish stolen clothes. For a while, she lived with her jazz musician boyfriend there in Cleveland, but she caught him cheating and had shot at him with her Smith & Wesson lemon squeezer, landing her there in jail.
She'd had one wild life. But now she was 57 years old and slowly going blind. She enjoyed crocheting, making people little baby dolls, saying she had never once received a doll as a child herself.
Sam's jail cell was directly below Lucy and Jean's, and they could communicate by shouting to each other through a crack in the floor, which is how Sam got to know her, envisioning a black Jean Harlow in his mind, not realizing he was talking to a wizened old woman nearly 30 years older than him. Being Sam, he was flirting with her. Like most psychopaths, he was a master manipulator and knew how to lay on the charm.
Eventually, Lucy agreed to testify for the state against Sam and was released. And Jean told Sam all about how he was being betrayed. And when Jean herself was released, she made it a point to be at Sam's trial and support him. And when Sam was acquitted for lack of evidence and turned free, she gathered him up and took him home with her, just like she did with all of her stolen merchandise.
Sam was a little taken aback to see the half-blind old woman he'd envisioned as a sexy heartthrob. But to Jean, Samuel Little was the finest specimen of man she'd ever seen. He was the strongest, handsomest man on earth, and she'd strive to please him and do anything he asked for the rest of her life.
Jean lived in a little house filled to the brim with stolen goods, mostly clothing, though there were purses, shoes, and even furniture as well. The front door had been sawed in half so that if someone knocked, she could open the upper part and sell them stolen items through it without actually letting them into the house. She basically ran a little secondhand store. And I bet they had some fly-ass clothing in there, man.
I would wager to guess you are absolutely spot on.
I'd get myself a pork pie hat there.
Since Jean was nearly blind, she needed a driver to take her to stores, where she'd fill garment bags with goods, even belly crawling behind the counter to steal jewelry. She was a master thief and never got caught. She just needed a driver, which Sam was happy to do. They were in business together.
The two of them had lived a life on the open road before they met. They were constantly on the move, which, as criminals, kept them one step ahead of the law. And soon the two were on the road together. In 1973, they swung down to the Big Easy, New Orleans, where Sam prowled the streets and bars, picking up a girl named Sarah Brown, who worked in a restaurant on Canal Street, charming her, seducing her, strangling her, and leaving her like trash, getting in the car and moving on to a different state.
Sam loved Jean's cooking, told her she should open a restaurant. Jean had long thought of giving up stealing and living a straight life, so after saving up their money, in 1973, the couple moved to Miami by Sam's mother, Bessie May, where they opened a soul food restaurant called Samuel Little's Southern Kitchen.
I would love to see the logo for that place. The restaurant was doing well. Jean knew how to run things and make things happen. Things were good. Jean could be sassy, but didn't really mind that Sam would take the car out cruising the bars and juke joints all night. Sometimes she'd find jewelry in the backseat, even shoes. But she didn't ask questions, just gathered up the goods to sell. But when Sam's mother, Bessie May, died, he went into a dark, dark place. And when Jean sassed him about it, saying it was well known that he'd slept with her and had probably fucked his own mother more times than he'd fucked her, he lost his mind. He beat Jean down in the middle of the street, probably would have killed her if a neighbor hadn't stepped in with a shotgun, pointed it at his head, and told him to get going.
Sam roamed, going down into Knox County, Tennessee, and strangling 34-year-old Martha Cunningham. Then on to Memphis, New Orleans, even the Bahamas for a while, leaving bodies in his wake. Always seeking out the ones he thought no one would miss, The most marginalized, the addicts, the sex workers, the rejected. Always on the move, never staying long enough in one place to be remembered.
In September of 1976, he was in Sunset, Missouri, when a victim somehow got away, managed to get free and go screaming down the road naked, banging on doors, her face beaten in, her neck an ugly circle of bruises, wrists bound with electrical wire.
She'd been beaten, bitten, strangled, sodomized, and tortured by Sam, who, incidentally, is not a bear. And for all this, he was found guilty of assault with intent to ravish and served only 3 months. 3 months, a fraction of the time he'd served for stealing a suit and fedora from a dry cleaner's. At that time and place, Black sex workers were literally worth less than 2 suits and a hat in the eyes of the justice system.
3 months is so fucked up. And also, you think like non-violent drug offenders at that time were getting just like decades. It's fuck crazy.
Jean somehow tracked him down in jail. She always did. Told him she was in Los Angeles now, invited him out, so he went there, booking a room at the infamous Cecil Hotel.
Jean had a big party for him, showered him with affection and love, and they were together again and decided to head out, start their criminal enterprise of stealing and murdering yet again.
Chapter 4. Jean and Sam and Danny. In 1977, Sam and Jean roamed together like something out of a horror novel. During the day, she'd shoplift, setting up shop in seedy neighborhoods. At night, Sam would kill. In the morning, she'd have to clean the car of blood, semen, and often the urine and defecation the women left behind as the life left their bodies. Women like Yvonne Pless in Mason, Georgia, and Clara Birdlong in Pascagoula, Mississippi.
And along the way, they picked up a developmentally disabled teenager named Danny. Jean said they needed a new driver, and she traded Danny's mother half a bottle of vodka and some stylish dresses for him. Just when you think it can't get any weirder, right? This guy who was saved by the legless rag and bone man as a baby is now roaming the country as a serial killer with his master thief older girlfriend who was a literal circus freak and now a disabled teenager that they'd bought for a bottle of vodka. It's insane.
Jean just called Danny the driver. Sam called him son.
I think you can see Sam being a master manipulator there, fostering this father and son relationship, trying to make Danny think he cares about him, which he doesn't. We'll see that neither Sam nor Jean care at all about this poor kid.
Jean and Sam would go over a map, outlining routes and where they wanted to stop and set up shop, the best places to steal and sell stolen goods, like Pascagoula, Mississippi, where on one side of the road was the projects, and the other, what they called the Stroll, a strip of juke joints and pool halls, the King William Hotel, a place rife with a rowdy nightlife and rich with African American culture.
People gathered there from all over the country to barter and trade in black market goods, pork pie hats and zoot suits, drugs, guns, prostitutes. Sam called it Candyland. Then they'd give the map to Danny, who'd drive, and along the way, they'd use Danny's ID to check into cheap hotels. And Danny would help Jean set up her little vendor area, popping open the trunk and setting up all their stolen goods for sale.
They traveled through Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where the body of 19-year-old Evelyn Weston was found strangled to death, and into Gulfport, Mississippi, where Sam strangled 36-year-old Julia Critchfield and threw her body off a cliff. And as 1978 turned into 1979, into Phoenix City, Alabama, where Sam murdered 23-year-old Brenda Alexander. and to Dade County, Georgia, where Patricia Parker was strangled to death.
During this time, Danny says Sam would often sleep all day in some cheap hotel, and he and Jean would have to hose the back seat of the car out, collecting any jewelry that may have fallen off of one of Sam's victims before driving out to find a projects or black market area and setting up shop to sell their stolen goods.
In November, he picked up 19-year-old Lila McLean, known as Bowlegs, offered her $50 for sex. She told him she had a room at a local hotel, but instead he started driving her out to the country, his eyes growing black. But Bowlegs knew the score. She jerked the steering wheel, tried to hit the gas pedal, and crashed the car. When Sam swung at her, she ducked and swerved and hit him back. Bowlegs knew how to box. She also fought dirty and managed to get a hold of his hand and bite the living shit out of him. And she got away. Out of all the women, those who died, those who lived, she was the only one who physically fought her way out.
Go Bowlegs. The bizarre threesome moved along as the 70s became the 80s. Like something out of a Stephen King book or something, stealing and bartering, moving through Warren County, Kentucky, where 23-year-old Linda Sue Boards was murdered in May of 1981. By October, they were in Grove City, Ohio, where Anna Stewart was dumped. And then down to Marion County, Florida, where Rosie Hill was killed. And into Mason, Georgia, where Sam murdered 18-year-old Fredonia Smith. And then into Houma, Louisiana, where 55-year-old Dorothy Richards had the misfortune of meeting Sam, then strangling Linda Sue Boards to death in Warren County, Kentucky.
Sam attacked a young prostitute named Hilda Nelson in her room at a hotel in Pascagoula, strangling her until she passed out, and then attempting to drown her in the bathtub. She was miraculously saved when her friend Layla McLean burst in. Hilda and Lila reported the incident to police, but they did nothing.
In September of 1982, 26-year-old Patricia Mount was found naked and dead in a field in Alachua County, Florida. Eyewitnesses said Sam was the last one seen with her, leaving a bar in Gainesville. He was arrested, tried for the murder, but Jean took the stand and gave him an airtight alibi, saying there was no way he could have committed the murder. He was with her all night. He was found not guilty by the jury and released.
In October, the skeletal remains of 22-year-old Melinda Laprie were found by a groundskeeper in a cemetery near Pascagoula, Mississippi. Witnesses again reported seeing her getting into a car with Sam Little. Though there was nothing left but a skeleton when she was discovered, her hyoid bone was clearly broken, indicating strangulation. A BOLO, or be on the lookout, was issued for Samuel Little, and when he was eventually picked up for shoplifting, he was interrogated and booked for murder as well.
And now police finally took notice of Hilda Nelson and Leila McLean and questioned them and had them ID Sam. But the women were bitter, thinking attention was finally being given because Melinda Laprie was a white woman, that no one cared when a black sex worker was assaulted or murdered. And sadly, they were absolutely right. Sam himself knew this and exploited it.
Hilda was pregnant at this point, and she and Layla walked all the way to the courthouse in the Mississippi heat to testify at the trial. When she saw Samuel Little in person again, she grew so frightened that she lost control of her bladder. Courtroom officials made her clean up the mess, then kicked them out and never called on them to testify.
Meanwhile, Sam and Jean tried to pin the murder on Danny, who had no idea what was even going on. Jean had even taken newspaper clippings of the murders and planted them on Danny. And with the seed of doubt sown as to who was the killer, a grand jury found the evidence was lacking, and Sam was never even indicted. Police sent Danny back to his mother.
It was now 1984, and Sam and Jean moved on to Cleveland, where Sam met Mary Jo Payton in a bar, took her out to an abandoned factory, and choked the life out of her before throwing her down a basement staircase, where two workers from a nearby company would eventually discover her. Then to Savannah, Georgia, where Francis Campbell fell prey to the hands of Samuel Little.
Always on the move, he described himself as a lion on the hunt. He and Jean cruised westward until they hit the ocean and could go west no more. They were back in California again. And in September of 1984, Samuel Little went into berserker mode in San Diego and grabbed a woman named Laurie Barrows right off the street, literally abducting her with brute force and physically dragging her into his black Thunderbird. When Sam talks about these murders, he romanticizes them, claims that they weren't violent at all, that he loved these women, and that often these women wanted to die, that the act was actually pleasurable for them. But Laurie Barrows, she survived her attack, and there was nothing romantic about it.
He handcuffed her and beat her, driving her out to a trash-strewn no-man's land, where he told her to swallow as he caressed her throat, telling her he loved to see them swallow, and then strangled her as he masturbated, and then tossed her out into a pile of garbage. She lived and managed to stagger away to safety and report the incident to the police.
Just a month later, Sam was back in the same exact place and was caught in the middle of strangling a woman named Tanya Jackson by police who rolled up on him. When he saw the cop car pull up, he stopped what he was doing and quickly hopped out of the car, holding his hands up in a friendly gesture. He had phlegm and blood all over his shirt.
He claimed he and the woman were just having an argument, and that, yes, he'd grabbed her by the throat and she would be bruised, but that there would be no signs of rape, which there weren't. That wasn't his thing. He liked to masturbate while strangling women. Also something you don't see bears doing.
The obvious connection to the Laurie Barrows assault was made, and Laurie picked him out of a lineup, having him repeat the phrase, "Swallow for me. I love to see you swallow," over and over, just to let him know that she was alive. And Laurie bravely testified at the trial, telling all her harrowing ordeal of being grabbed off the street, handcuffed, and brought to a desolate place to be assaulted and left on the side of the road like trash.
Jean sat at the trial each and every day, prim and proper, a Bible in her lap, showing her support, proclaiming his innocence. But Samuel Little was found guilty for the assaults of Laurie and Tanya. But he would serve only 18 months, and then he was released again, heading north to Los Angeles, where Jean was waiting for him.
Just 18 months. What the fuck? Well, crack was hitting the streets hard by now, becoming an epidemic, destroying African-American neighborhoods, decimating families. And what did Samuel Little think of this drug scourge laying waste to cities across America? Well, Sam thought smoking crack was like seeing the face of God, and reasoned, how could something that felt so good be wrong? Just like strangling women. In fact, he found the two distinctly delightful when done in tandem. Sam took to the underworld of Los Angeles, smoking crack in back alleys, stalking the dive bars of Skid Row, the pool halls and juke joints, Fletcher's Bar, picking up women he thought wouldn't be missed and leaving them for dead.
There were so many serial killers at work in Los Angeles by this point. The hillside stranglers, all three freeway killers, bodies turning up in alleys and hillsides, women, men, and the night stalkers upping the game and breaking into random houses at night. It was utter mayhem and insanity.
As invisible as Sam may have felt, some of these crimes would come back to haunt him. like Guadalupe Apacata, who was found in an abandoned auto repair shop by a little boy kicking a soccer ball, and Audrey Nelson Everett, who was found in a dumpster behind a nightclub, and Carol Linda Alford. There is no statute of limitations on murder, meaning that even though the case may go cold, the evidence is kept. And 25 years later, a pernicious homicide detective would find Sam Little's DNA was under all of these women's fingernails, as well as on their clothing.
Jean died of a brain aneurysm in Los Angeles in 1988, just keeled over dead one day. Sam says he felt guilty, wondered if his violence could have caused it. But the hospital assured him aneurysms weren't caused from multiple head injuries. Most likely it was inherited. Just something you are born with that sits there in your brain like a ticking bomb waiting to go off. Sam just left her body for her family to deal with, abandoned her again for a final time. They'd been together nearly 2 decades, through thick and thin, but he was done with her now, and she was finally completely useless to him.
Chapter 5. On the Road Again. Samuel Little did what he always did. Got in his car and drove and drove and drove. A dangerous, psychopathic predator, hunting the dark alleys and seedy bars of the American night. By July of 1990, he was clear across the country in Memphis, Tennessee, where he picked up Zena Marie Jones, strangled her in his car as a policeman passed, and then dumped her body off a bridge in West Memphis, Arkansas, into the dark waters of the Mississippi River, where she'd eventually wash ashore and be found by fishermen.
In August of 1991, he was in Cleveland, Ohio again, dumping the body of Rose Evans in a vacant lot on East 39th Street, and then back in Los Angeles, where he managed to buy himself an old Cadillac.
He was cruising through the dark back alleys of South Central Los Angeles on May 2nd, 1992, when he saw the glow of flames light up the sky. The city was on fire. Riots were raging over the verdicts of the Rodney King trial. But Sam could care less about police brutality. That was just the way of the world. Nothing was going to change it. The secret was, don't get caught. And if you do, get a lawyer and keep your mouth shut.
Sam drove through police barricades, burnt out cars, looters, military tanks, and scores of riot police, going completely unnoticed, almost invisible, and sensing an opportunity to seize prey.
As the riots raged about him, Sam noticed a woman sitting on the steps of a cheap hotel, smoking a cigarette. A big-legged girl in a house dress and slippers. He enticed her into his Cadillac. It didn't take much. Then took her to a deserted street where they smoked crack together before he strangled her, thinking he could dump her body just about anywhere. With the riots going on, no one would notice another dead body amongst the rubble.
And the echoing siren song of the road called, and he traveled forth, moving through Texas in 1994, leaving Denise Christie brothers dead in Odessa. By now, he was a seasoned pro, able to drift like a phantom across the country. No registered address, no credit cards, staying in flop houses and homeless shelters, hustling, conniving, moving through Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where the body of Yolanda Jones would be found. Then down to Louisiana again, murdering 40-year-old Daisy McGuire in Houma. And into Opelousas, where he left the body of 29-year-old Melissa Thomas in the Little Zion graveyard.
As he grew older, his sex drive slowly declined, his testosterone waning, and with it, the urge to kill. He went gray, developed diabetes, his joints swelling, ankles and toes swollen. The centuries changed. He turned 60 in the year 2000, and his killing became sporadic at most. And in 2005, he committed his last murder, killing 46-year-old Nancy Carol Stevens in Tupelo, Mississippi.
While he gave up murder, he continued to travel: Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, Florida, Ohio, and finally down to Kentucky. It was now 2012. He hadn't killed anyone in nearly a decade. He figured God had forgiven him. Doesn't it say right in the Bible that the Lord Jesus forgives all those who ask? And weren't all sins equal in the eyes of the Lord? In the end, murder wasn't any worse than stealing candy. A sinner was a sinner, and that was all behind him now.
He'd gotten away with it. How many murders? When he ran them through his head, he came up with 93, and he savored them all. Could still imagine each of the women perfectly in his mind. He could draw them from memory, and the memories were all he had now. He was just an old man receiving disability payments from the government, though he still loves smoking crack with sex workers. Some things will never change.
Little did he know that back in Los Angeles, cold case homicide detective Mitzi Roberts had been meticulously going over decades of old evidence and had discovered DNA connecting him to the Los Angeles murders of Guadalupe Apocata, Audrey Nelson Everett, and Carol Linda Alford from way back in the 1980s when he'd been known as the choke and stroke killer. And Mitzi was at that very moment doing all she could to track him down, hot on his trail as he wandered aimlessly state to state, cashing his disability payments at rundown liquor stores and staying in seedy flop houses and homeless shelters, thinking all his sins had been forgiven.
And in September of 2012, Sam caught the eye of a detective outside a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, as he consorted with some known sex workers. Patting the old man down, the detective found a crack pipe and ran his name. Ultimately, Sam was given a warning and let go. But when they ran his name and his address at the Wayfair homeless shelter in Kentucky, way across the country in Los Angeles, Detective Mitzi Roberts' computer binged, telling her his whereabouts. And within hours, federal marshals were taking him into custody.
They were able to hold him on an old narcotics charge, a minor thing. They'd yet to indict him on the murders. And Sam was not making it easy, demanding a lawyer, well aware of his rights and due process, pleading his innocence, saying he was being framed, that DNA proved nothing.
The story of how this cold-blooded killer eventually cracked and began to confess his crimes is like something from a thriller novel or Silence of the Lambs movie. Seriously, if you think this story is weird now, just wait. This is just the beginning. It gets much crazier, just insane. But to hear that, you're going to have to tune in next week for the conclusion of the story of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history.
See you next week.
See you next week, guys, and you know we want to hear from you. You got a case you think we should cover? Did we get something wrong? You just want to say hi? Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week.